It was a quiet summer evening when I first heard the knock on my door. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow over the neighborhood, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of freshly cut grass. I had been sitting in my living room, lost in the pages of a book, when the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I opened the door to find Mrs. Hollis, my 65-year-old neighbor, standing on the porch. She looked the same as always, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her soft eyes framed by delicate crow's feet. There was a warmth to her, a quiet elegance that I had always admired from afar. But tonight something seemed different. She looked nervous, her hands wringing together as if she was struggling with something. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft and apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need a favor." I smiled politely, hiding my curiosity. "Of course, Mrs. Hollis. What can I help you with?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one else was watching, before turning back to me. "It's the basement," she said quietly. "I've been hearing strange noises down there, and I'm too frightened to check on my own. Would you mind coming over to take a look?" The request was simple enough, but there was something in the way she said it that gave me pause. I had known Mrs. Hollis for years, ever since I had moved into the house next door after college, and she had always been calm, composed, unshakable. But tonight, there was a vulnerability in her that I hadn't seen before. "Of course," I said, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind me. "I'll grab a flashlight." Her house was only a few steps away, but the walk felt longer tonight. The warm evening air hung heavy between us as we made our way down the quiet street, the only sound the gentle hum of cicadas in the distance. I glanced over at her as we walked, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, the way her breath seemed to catch every few steps. Once inside, Mrs. Hollis led me through the dimly lit hallway, her fingers grazing the wall as if for support. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, a comforting yet oddly nostalgic scent. She stopped at the door to the basement, her hand hovering over the doorknob as though hesitant to open it. "I've lived here for nearly 30 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I've never been scared of anything in this house. But lately, I don't know. It feels different." Her words lingered in the air between us, and for a moment either of us moved. There was a tension building, something unspoken yet palpable, like the slow tightening of a coil. "Whatever it is, I'm sure it's nothing," I said, hoping to ease her mind. "Let's take a look." She nodded and opened the door, the old wood creaking as it swung open. The staircase leading down to the basement was narrow and steep, the air growing cooler with each step. I flicked on the flashlight, casting a beam of light into the darkness below. Mrs. Hollis stayed close behind me, her hand brushing against my shoulder as we descended the stairs. The basement was just as I remembered it, cluttered with old boxes, dusty furniture, and remnants of a life lived long before I had moved next door. But there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No strange noises, no flickering lights. Just the quiet hum of the old boiler in the corner. "I don't hear anything now," I said, turning to face her. "Maybe it was just the pipes." She nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. Her eyes lingered on the far corner of the room, as if searching for something that wasn't there. And then, almost as if by instinct, she reached out and placed her hand on my arm, her fingers gripping me just a little tighter than necessary. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to be down here alone." Her touch sent a jolt through me, unexpected and strangely intimate. I looked down at her hand, then back at her, and for the first time, I noticed how close we were standing. Too close. "It's no problem," I said, though my voice felt strained. "You're safe now." She didn't let go of my arm. Instead, her grip tightened, just slightly, and she took a small step closer. The air between us seemed to thicken, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. Her eyes met mine, and there was something there, something I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. Longing. "I don't feel safe," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Not anymore." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. There was something happening here, something I hadn't anticipated. The basement, the strange noises, the requests for help, it all felt like an excuse for something else, something deeper. And now, standing here in the dim light of the basement, her hand still on my arm, I could feel the shift between us. "Mrs. Hollis," I began, my voice faltering. "I should probably—" "Please," she interrupted, her voice suddenly urgent. "Call me Evelyn." Her fingers brushed against my skin again, and this time, I didn't pull away. There was a warmth in her touch, a quiet desperation that I hadn't noticed before. She was lonely, I realized. So lonely. "I shouldn't be here," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Evelyn stepped closer, her body now just inches from mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I don't want to be alone anymore." There it was, the truth. She wasn't asking for help with the basement. She was asking for something else entirely, something far more dangerous. I could feel it in the way her fingers lingered on my skin, the way her breath hitched in her throat as she looked at me. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached up and placed my hand over hers, feeling the softness of her skin beneath my fingers. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, and in that moment, the line between us blurred. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I had done, what we were doing. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, wide and vulnerable, searching for some sign of rejection, a reason to pull back. But I didn't give her one. I couldn't. Instead, I let my hand linger over hers, feeling the warmth of her skin, the delicate pulse beneath her fingertips. For a moment, we stood there, frozen in place, the quiet hum of the basement around us the only sound. I knew I should say something, that I should step away, pull my hand back, and pretend this moment never happened. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was a gravity to her presence, a pull I hadn't felt before, something that kept me rooted in place, unable to move. "Evelyn," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the basement. She blinked, her eyes softening as she looked at me, and then, slowly, almost hesitantly, she closed the distance between us. Her body pressed lightly against mine, her hand still resting on my arm, her breath warm against my neck. Every instinct in my body told me to pull away, to stop whatever was happening before it went any further. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. "I don't know what I'm doing," she murmured, her voice trembling with a mix of uncertainty and longing. I haven't felt like this in so long. I didn't expect." Her words trailed off, but I understood. I felt it too, the confusion, the guilt, the overwhelming desire to let go of all the reasons why this was wrong, and just give in to what we were both feeling. There was something about being here, in this quiet, forgotten corner of the house, that made everything else fade away. The rest of the world didn't matter. It was just the two of us. Without thinking, I moved my hand to her waist, gently pulling her closer, feeling the soft curve of her body against mine. Her breath hitched as she let out a soft gasp, her eyes searching mine for reassurance. I gave her a small nod, though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring, her or myself. "I've thought about this," she admitted in a hushed voice, her fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt. "More than I should have." Her words sent a shiver through me, igniting a spark of something I hadn't realized had been building between us for months. There had always been something unspoken between us, a quiet connection that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge until now. But here, in the dim light of the basement, with her body pressed against mine, it was impossible to ignore. "I don't want to hurt you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to do something we'll regret." Her eyes softened, and she reached up to touch my cheek, her thumb brushing lightly over my skin. "I'm already hurt, Ethan. Every day I feel it. But tonight I just want to feel something else." Her words hung in the air between us, and I knew then that there was no going back. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long finally rising to the surface. It was dangerous, forbidden, but in that moment, it was all I could think about. Slowly, I leaned in, my lips hovering just inches from hers. I could feel her breath against my skin, warm and unsteady, as if she was holding herself back, waiting for me to make the first move. And then, without another thought, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to hers in a soft, hesitant kiss. For a moment, neither of us moved. The kiss was tentative, almost unsure, as if we were both afraid of what might happen if we gave in. But then, something shifted. Evelyn's hand slid up to the back of my neck, her fingers threading through my hair, and she kissed me back with a quiet intensity that took my breath away. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, filled with all the longing and desire we had been holding back for so long. Her body melted against mine, her hands gripping my shoulders as if afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every touch, every breath, felt like a release, a surrender to something we had both been fighting for too long. I backed her up against the wall, my hands sliding down to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss grew more urgent, more desperate. I could feel the heat building between us, the weight of everything we were doing pressing down on me, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to. The taste of her lips, the softness of her skin beneath my hands, it was all I could focus on. Her hands moved to my chest, gripping the fabric of my shirt as she gasped for breath, her lips parting against mine in a soft moan. It was a sound I had never heard from her before, and it sent a surge of heat through me, igniting a fire I hadn't realized was there. "We can't," she whispered, her voice trembling with the same conflict I was feeling. "But I don't want to stop." I pressed my forehead against hers, breathing hard, trying to catch my breath. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice rough with emotion. There was a beat of silence between us, and then, without another word, she pulled me back to her, kissing me with a hunger that left no room for doubt. Her hands were on me, pulling me closer, urging me to let go of all the reasons why this was wrong. And for the first time, I did. We lost ourselves in the kiss, in the heat and the tension that had been building between us for months. Every touch, every breath, felt electric, charged with the knowledge that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All I could think about was her, Evelyn, and the way she made me feel, alive and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. Our hands explored each other with a desperate urgency, the basement around us fading into the background. The only thing that existed was the two of us, and the quiet understanding that whatever this was, whatever we were doing, it couldn't be undone. And maybe, we didn't want it to be. As the intensity of the moment grew, I could feel the weight of everything crashing down on me, our ages, our lives, the world outside this room. But Evelyn's touch, her breathless whispers, kept pulling me back in, grounding me in the here and now. "I need this," she whispered against my lips, her voice raw and pleading. "I need you." Her words broke something inside me, and I kissed her harder, more desperately, as if trying to make up for all the lost time, all the months of unspoken tension between us. Her hands gripped my shirt, pulling me closer, as we moved together in a slow, deliberate rhythm, lost in the heat of the moment. But as the night wore on, and the intensity of our connection began to fade, the reality of what we had done settled over us like a heavy weight. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The tension between us, once unspoken and hidden, had been laid bare, and now we were left to grapple with the consequences. We pulled apart, both of us breathing hard, our bodies still trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. Evelyn's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of desire, guilt, and confusion. I could see it all there, written across her face, the same emotions that were swirling inside me. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know where we go from here." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something had changed between us, something we couldn't undo. The weight of it hung heavy in the air between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. There was too much to say, too many emotions to process. Finally, I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll figure it out, I said softly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. She nodded, her eyes downcast, and we stood there in the dim light of the basement, both of us lost in the enormity of what we had done. The connection between us was undeniable, but now, with the weight of reality pressing down on us, it felt fragile, uncertain. We had crossed a line. And now, there was no going back. The basement felt colder now, the quiet hum of the boiler the only sound between us as we stood in silence, our hands still loosely connected. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on us, thick and suffocating, like the heavy air before a storm. We were teetering on the edge of something profound and terrifying, and neither of us knew what to say or where to go from here. Evelyn's eyes drifted away from mine, settling somewhere on the floor as she tried to gather herself. Her fingers slipped from my hand, and I felt the loss of her touch immediately, as if something vital had been severed. She stepped back, her movements slow and tentative, as if she were afraid any sudden action might shatter the delicate, precarious moment we were trapped in. She began, but her voice faltered, cracking under the weight of everything she was feeling. I took a step closer, instinctively reaching for her again, but she raised a hand to stop me, shaking her head ever so slightly. Her eyes met mine briefly, filled with an emotion I couldn't fully decipher. Guilt, yes, but also fear, and beneath it all, the lingering remnants of desire. "I need a moment," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to think." I nodded, even though I didn't want to let her retreat. I didn't want this moment to unravel into something we would both regret later. But the confusion in her eyes was mirrored in my own heart, and I couldn't force her to stay in this uncertainty any longer. Evelyn turned away, her hand trembling as she wiped a stray tear from her cheek. She started to ascend the narrow staircase, her footsteps slow and deliberate, each one heavier than the last. I stood frozen, watching her disappear up the stairs, unsure if I should follow or if it was better to give her space. The basement felt emptier without her, the air colder, as if the warmth we had shared had been snatched away by the cool night air seeping through the cracks in the foundation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something irrevocable had changed, not just between us, but within me as well. There was no undoing what had happened, no way to erase the touch of her lips, the warmth of her body against mine. I wanted to call her back, to tell her that we could figure this out together, that whatever this was, we could make it work. But the truth was, I didn't have the answers. I didn't know how to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that had taken hold of me. The guilt, the desire, the confusion, they all warred inside me, and I had no idea how to reconcile them. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly made my way up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was quiet, eerily so, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found Evelyn in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with her back to me. She was staring out the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to protect herself from the storm raging inside her. I wanted to go to her, to tell her that we could figure this out, that whatever happened between us didn't have to be the end. But as I stood there, watching her, I realized that I didn't even know where to begin. How could I explain what had happened when I didn't fully understand it myself? "Evelyn," I said softly, my voice breaking the silence between us. She didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders tense at the sound of my voice. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "I shouldn't have," she began, but her voice trailed off, as if she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. She shook her head, her silver hair catching the soft light from the kitchen, and when she finally turned to face me, her eyes were filled with a sadness that cut me to the core. "We can't undo what just happened," she said, her voice steady but fragile. "And I don't know how to live with that." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her that we didn't need to undo it, that we could find a way to move forward together. But the look in her eyes told me that she wasn't ready to hear that. She was scared of what we had done, scared of what it meant, scared of the consequences that would inevitably follow. "I don't regret it," I said, taking a step closer to her, my voice firm despite the chaos inside me. I don't know what this means yet, but I don't regret it. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her posture, wiping the tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, and nodded. I don't either, she whispered, barely meeting my gaze. But that doesn't mean it isn't wrong. The room fell into a heavy silence again, the weight of her words hanging in the air between us. We both knew the truth. What had happened between us wasn't something that could be easily explained or justified. It wasn't something that could be erased or forgotten, and it had already changed the dynamic between us in ways that neither of us could fully understand. I think you should go, Evelyn said quietly, her eyes downcast. I need time. I need to figure this out on my own. I felt my heart sink at her words, but I knew she was right. I couldn't push her to make sense of what had happened any more than I could make sense of it myself. We had crossed the line that night, and there was no going back. But I also knew that leaving her now, walking away from this moment, didn't feel right either. Are you sure? I asked, my voice soft but filled with the hope that she might change her mind. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, fear, sadness, longing, and nodded. I'm sure. I hesitated for a moment longer, searching her face for any sign that she might want me to stay, that we might be able to talk this through and find some sort of resolution. But all I saw in her eyes was the same conflict I felt inside, an overwhelming sense of guilt, desire, and uncertainty. With a heavy heart, I nodded and turned toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I felt her presence behind me, her quiet breath lingering in the space between us. For a brief moment, I considered turning back, telling her that we didn't have to figure everything out right now, that we could take our time and make sense of this together. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the warmth of her home and the weight of what we had shared. The walk back to my house felt longer than it should have, the night air biting at my skin as I tried to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I kept replaying the events of the night in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more tangled my thoughts became. I didn't regret what had happened. That much was clear. But the guilt gnawed at me, threatening to consume me with every step I took. I knew that what we had done wasn't something that could easily be explained or justified, but I also knew that the connection between us was real, palpable in a way that I hadn't experienced before. As I reached my front door and stepped inside, the emptiness of my own home hit me harder than it ever had before. The silence felt oppressive, the stillness a stark contrast to the emotional intensity one had just left behind. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes as I tried to steady my breathing, but the weight of what had happened between Evelyn and me wouldn't let go. We had crossed the line, and now we were both left to grapple with the consequences, alone, uncertain, and confused. I spent the next few days in a haze, consumed by the memory of that night in Evelyn's basement. No matter how hard I tried to focus on my work, my mind kept drifting back to her, her touch, the way her lips had felt against mine, the heat of her body pressed so close to me. But along with those thoughts came an overwhelming sense of guilt and confusion, emotions that gnawed at me every waking moment. I hadn't heard from her since that night. I'd seen her lights on in the evenings, watched her move around her house from afar, but there had been no sign that she wanted to talk or see me again. I respected her space, giving her the time she had asked for, but each day felt like a quiet agony. The uncertainty weighed on me more than I cared to admit. Finally, on a warm Friday evening, after nearly a week of silence, there was a knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I already knew who it was before I opened it. Evelyn stood on my porch, her silver hair gleaming softly in the twilight. She looked different tonight, more composed, but there was something else in her expression, something I couldn't quite place. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick with the weight of everything we hadn't said since that night. Evelyn, I began, but she raised a hand to stop me. Please, she said quietly. Can I come in? I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She entered slowly, her movements measured and deliberate, as though she was still unsure of what to say or how to feel. I closed the door behind her, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for her to speak. We stood in the entryway for what felt like an eternity, the silence between us heavy and charged. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes filled with the same mixture of emotions I had seen that night in the basement: longing, guilt, fear. But there was something else too, something deeper, more resolute. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but steady, "about everything that happened. About us." I swallowed hard, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Me too," I admitted. Evelyn took a deep breath, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve as she searched for the right words. "That night, it wasn't just a moment of weakness, Ethan. It wasn't a mistake, at least not in the way I thought it was." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I understood, that I felt the same way. But I waited, letting her continue. "I've been alone for a long time," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Longer than I realized. And when you came into my life, I didn't expect to feel anything. Not like this." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Neither did I." She looked down, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her. "I've been trying to figure out what this means, what we mean. And I still don't know. But what I do know is that I can't pretend like it didn't happen. I can't pretend like I don't feel something for you." Her words hit me like a wave, and I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen, replaced by a flicker of hope. I stepped closer to her, my voice soft as I spoke. "I don't want to pretend either, Evelyn. I can't stop thinking about you. About us." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "But where does that leave us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many complications that we hadn't even begun to address. The difference in our ages, the way our neighbors or families might see us, it all loomed over us like a dark cloud. But in that moment, none of it felt as important as the connection we had, the feelings we shared. "I don't know," I admitted, taking her hand in mine. "But I do know that I don't want to lose you. I want to figure this out together." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for any hint of doubt. But I was certain now, more certain than I had been that night in the basement. Whatever this was between us, it was real. It was messy and complicated, but it was real. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around mine. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What if this isn't enough? What if we're making a mistake?" I stepped closer, cupping her face in my hands as I met her gaze. "We might be," I said softly. "But I'd rather make that mistake with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded slowly, leaning into my touch. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. "You don't have to be," I said, my voice filled with quiet resolve. "Not if you don't want to." For a moment, we stood there in the stillness of my living room, the weight of our emotions hanging in the air between us. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Evelyn leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a soft, tentative kiss. It wasn't the heated, desperate kiss we had shared in the basement, but something different, something deeper. It was a kiss filled with all the longing, all the fear, and all the hope we had been carrying with us since that night. When we pulled away, Evelyn rested her forehead against mine, her breath warm against my skin. "We'll take it one day at a time," she whispered. "We'll figure this out. Together." I smiled, my heart swelling with a quiet sense of relief and hope. "Together," I repeated. And in that moment, standing there with Evelyn in my arms, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever fears and doubts we might face, we would face them together. The future was uncertain, and there were no easy answers. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. We weren't alone. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, but instead of regret, there was something else waiting for us on the other side: possibility, hope, and the promise of something more. And as I held her close, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it hand in hand, together.